Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. Today's guest, Lena Slackmulder, is a veteran journalist turned peace builder. She spent the 1990s in South Africa, covering the lead-up to the end of apartheid and the early years of democratic rule. In 2001, she took a job with the global peace-building organization Search for Common Ground in Burundi, an East African country in the midst of a civil war. The radio studio she directed there produced 100 radio programs per month to promote dialogue, peace, and reconciliation. Today, Lena directs the digital peace-building initiative at Search for Common Ground, and she's co-chair of the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion, a movement to challenge the way algorithms are used by the major social media platforms. Their algorithms are currently designed to make money by promoting divisiveness. Those same tools, augmented by AI, could be used globally to dispel rumors, counter hate speech, and promote dialogue. Changing profit-driven tech companies is a huge challenge. But in a world where online animosity leads to real-world violence, this work is essential, certainly worth paying attention to. And that's the topic of today's conversation. There's a wonderful quote of Lena's that tells you a lot about her and her work. She says, "Peace is a choice, a perspective, and a commitment. Change is always possible, and ending violent conflict is the most consequential challenge of our time. My mission has been to empower journalists, entertainers, filmmakers, police officers, army generals, wardens, religious leaders, and others to become peace builders." So that's a very nice place to start. Lena, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jamil. I'm really happy to have this conversation today.
So I'm glad you're here to talk with us at this particular moment. Polarization is rampant and reaching dangerous levels. The social media platforms are aiding and abetting this almost criminal hijacking of our brains. And you and your colleagues at the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion want to change the situation, but you're focused on design solutions. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure, Jamil. I think that it's really important for us to realize that over this last couple decades, as we've been using these social media platforms, we've been able to experience a really enormous amount of positive benefits, connecting, learning, growing, and expanding our horizons. But more and more, it's become evident that with that comes a lot of really dangerous and toxic harms that are actually preying on some of our human vulnerabilities and are really promoting some of the toxic polarization that we're experiencing across the world. And this is because many of these commercial platforms are designed to keep people on them as long as possible so that that engagement can attract advertising revenue. And as a result, the design choices that those companies have made are really harmful for us. And they're pushing us away from each other, deteriorating the trust that we have in each other and in our leaders. And it's really a problem for people looking to build peace in the world today.
Yes. I mean, to most people, changing something like an algorithm that's so abstract and hard to see, I mean, indeed, it's absolutely invisible, is a huge challenge. I mean, we must recognize the damage these mathematical tools have done to humans is very real, and we must do something about them. But how do you get people to understand what it is?
Well, I share that sense of almost powerlessness, right? Like, how can one person change the choices of a company that is actually, oftentimes accountable more to their shareholders than even to their clients and their users? And I think that's why at Search for Common Ground, we and other peace builders realized that we need to partner with technologists, with people that have done the data science work, that understand the tools and how they work and the key choices that can be made from within the companies. And so at the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion, working with people from the Integrity Institute, from the Neely Center, from the Center for Humane Technology has been incredibly powerful so that the joint efforts and advocacy to say, hey, these things need to change is both technically practical and understandable for the platforms, as well as supported by people who really know the consequences of online harms leading to offline violence.
In a sense, you've been taking a more active role in some of the monitoring. In one of your recent essays, you talked about digital stewardship. What is digital stewardship?
So with this question, Jamil, we're turning to the fact that even though we started off this conversation saying, wow, there's a lot of toxic polarization driven by design, at Search for Common Ground, we've also realized that it's not tomorrow that people are going to step away or boycott these platforms. So what is it that we can do to build trust online? And so digital community stewards are people that moderate online groups. Sometimes they're called admins or moderators, people who are the person who set up that WhatsApp group, set up that Facebook page, and they have the power to set the norms and the rules and to encourage healthy behaviors in those groups. And those are the digital community stewards that we've identified have real potential to build positive change.
From what I understand, Search has actually gotten into training people in stewardship. And as a result, you've kind of feeling somewhat more hopeful about how social media could be used for good.
I think that's right. The origin of this came from a really super program that our very innovative team in Sri Lanka did, where they decided, look, when you ask yourself as a peace builder, what should we do about the fake news and the harms and the hate speech online? A lot of times people say two things. Number one, we should get all those really popular influencers to promote peace. And we can have a longer conversation about that, but there's a lot of reasons why that rarely happens, because many of those influencers have themselves a set of incentives about their brand, their tone, and their message. The second answer is often, well, let's just give everybody digital skills so that they can protect themselves from all the hate speech and online harms. But the Sri Lanka team said, wait, there's actually another space where people are following gossip and fashion and sports and cooking. And those are online groups. And what if we were able to equip those people with the skills to hold space, to use the platform features and affordances correctly, to be able to navigate diversity, conflict, and difference in the groups, and to know in what ways that they can also prevent the spread of harmful and fake news. And it's the experience of that Sri Lanka team that actually was able, through the stewards, to prevent very dangerous rumors from taking off and triggering offline violence that inspired us to say, wait a second, this is actually something that has applicability globally. And that's how our curriculum came about. It's a curriculum both for offline teaching as well as a self-guided e-learning set of 9 modules.
That's great. And you've been experimenting with it in about 4 countries, I think Mali, Jordan, Sri Lanka, and in Kenya, I think. Is that right?
In fact, Jamil, we've had stewards from probably about 15 different countries. And the digital community stewards is one component of really long menu of things that we're doing in digital peace building, using digital tools to do better peace building.
Because that's one of the things that excites me about the work you are doing, because our focus at Making Peace Visible is really working with journalists and getting journalists to report more effectively and more thoughtfully about peace and conflict. But what I love about this is that it's getting the peace builders to use communications better rather than just waiting for somebody else to change the situation.
Absolutely. And, what's been really fascinating, again, we started the conversation about algorithms are hard to understand. But what's been really exciting and rewarding about these last, I would say maybe 6 years of really trying to understand what is digital peace building? What does it look like? And how do peace builders actually not just grab a tech tool thinking it's going to solve the problem, but how do they stay focused on what they know matters in peace building? And then ask the question, how can tech tools enhance that? Be it strengthening relationships, building trust, moving people from apathy to agency, creating, as we said, with those digital online groups, a sense of belonging.
No, and that's great. But I mean, these are private digital spaces. I mean, how do you identify them? How do you get to work with them?
Some Facebook groups are visible to the public and others are private. And with WhatsApp groups as well, they're often private. So effectively, again, in a similar way where if we're looking at a community that's being torn apart, we're going to ask ourselves, where are people receiving their information? Whom do they trust?
Critical question.
Right. And in the same way, we'll be asking the question, who's following whom online? And in what groups are people joining? And in that way, we'll then be able to find either the existing stewards or in some cases, igniting interest in young people or in women to become stewards themselves with the training and coaching that this curriculum offers.
Give me an example of digital stewardship that you think represents the potential that this kind of technique has.
One of the digital stewards that I recall engaged with our training curriculum, just as we were actually sort of piloting the final version, was a Sri Lankan sort of TV host, but who also had an online group. And in that group, it was more women that were her fans, and they were able to talk and share stories that were difficult for them to work through. And she had been able to create a more private, safe space. It was still a pretty large group, if I recall, that was able to enable women to talk through things like divorce or miscarriages or things that may have been challenging for them. And that group created such a sense of trust that those members, when they then would receive, a fake information or manipulative information, perhaps about the, turbulent political crisis that had been going on in Sri Lanka,
right,
they were better able to say, wait a second, I'm going to ask the women in my group what they think. And that's where you get this intersection between how do we enable these digital stewards and those groups to be places where people can feel that they have a trusted way of discerning what's real, what's fake, what's harmful, and what's helpful in all of the information they receive.
That word trust is really something that's critical, I think, to make things work. Another group that you've been involved with are micro-influencers. What is a micro-influencer, and why focus on people with fewer followers than macro?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jamil, because I mentioned earlier that a lot of times I've seen the peace builders and many of our locally led partners across the countries where we work, 40 countries in Africa, Asia, now Central America, and the Middle East. They often say, well, if we only could get that famous footballer or that famous movie star to promote, our shared humanity and things like that. But as I said, those people often have different incentives and they may not be interested in doing that kind of collaboration. So one of the things we've come to understand is that, again, when you look at different communities, you might find a community, for example, in the south of Tunisia or in the northern part of Kenya on the Somali border, where they may be following that football star, but there's also someone who speaks their language, who knows their culture, that they also admire. Or there may be someone who in the offline space is very trusted and respected. So here I want to give an example from Tunisia. The Ifriqiya Center for Common Ground is a locally led organization that emerged as Search decided to exit from the country. And they have recently concluded a program where they looked at 12 communities that were really struggling, a lot of apathy, a lot of grievances by young people in a very complicated political context where civic space is closing and there's huge sensitivity about sort of criticizing the government. So their approach was to say, well, what if we could identify young people who are trusted in different communities and then equip them with the digital skills to become more popular, to do the cool TikTok videos, to be able to do micro documentaries that elevate and expose the grievances of young people, but perhaps in not quite the most adversarial way, right?
Right.
And that's what they did, so that you're then equipping people who are already trusted to go online and do a better job of using those digital tools to shift the conversation, to advocate constructively. You know, we have another example where we've worked in Kyrgyzstan with religious leaders who were finding themselves lost in the online space, even though that's where some very harmful, manipulative narratives were taking place, you know, equating some versions of Islam with violent extremism, which we know is often, you know, completely false. But the religious leaders themselves weren't equipped with how to use social media appropriately, how to create followers, to do some of the basics. And so with coaching and training, we've enabled people like those young people in Tunisia, people like a young Somali Kenyan, or that religious leader in Kyrgyzstan to have a constructive voice and be able to both, you know, discern helpful and harmful content, but also elevate their own voice.
Yeah, because one issue in all of this is language.
One of the key things that we see at the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion is the need to continue expecting standards of content moderation by these platforms, but really also acknowledging that because of the diversity of languages, because at times even a well thought through policy on harmful content by a social media platform will easily find a workaround or an alternative by those really seeking to transmit harmful speech and content online. You know, in the end, you do need a combination of supporting, you know, trusted spaces online, understanding how that trust is built, as well as the ability to flag harmful content and bring it down swiftly and with, you know, the transparency and accountability that many groups, including ourselves, are demanding of the platforms. But it is a combination of both, you know, sort of machine learning tools and classifiers that can identify harmful content, as well as equipping people like the digital community stewards, as well as a wide range of people. You know, we certainly work with journalists, but one of the things that I've been impressed in our countries is the ability to also see not just religious leaders as trusted leaders, but also cultural figures. In Mali, a lot of the success of our fact-checking and digital literacy program was because we realized that griots, you know, are actually very trusted people. And so if they can be singing songs about don't be manipulated by fake news, well, it's going to go way further than a simple, you know, NGO project.
Right. Yeah, I did a lot of work in Mali, and I love using those kinds of local resources that are so valuable. It was a pleasure being together in California last year for the meeting of the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion. And I love the question that motivates that group is, what if technology fostered trust and collaboration instead of driving polarization and violence? That's a great question. I'm really glad that this organization is working to address it.
Well, I think that there's an enormous amount of really capable and devoted organizations that are mobilizing and advocating against the harms of technology. And one of those things that we're really excited about working on is what we call deliberative tech. And deliberative tech is a suite of different tools and platforms that are designed for people to deliberate, meaning that they can understand the issues on the table from diverse perspectives, that they can share their views, that they can give their opinion about other people's views. And the technology enables us to have large groups of people participating at scale, have the AI surfacing where there is agreement and disagreement, and emerging with a set of recommendations or things that people feel strongly should be decided upon. These are incredibly valuable tools.
What are some of the key recommendations that you have for tech developers?
I'll start just back on the deliberative tech side. There is decades of work on civic tech and trying to engage citizens in democracy, in voting, in contributing to, new legislation or policy proposals. And some of that has been incredibly successful, very powerful, and technologically, it's evolved a lot over the last 20 years. So if we actually enable technologists to work together with peace builders and people who are looking to be able to prevent violent conflict and address toxic polarization, we can find ourselves with tools that are really fit for purpose. And I truly believe that they can help us to get to know each other better, to find common ground, to see each other's humanity, and fundamentally rebuild the trust even across deep divides. This doesn't mean necessarily that we will make all of these changes within Meta, X, and TikTok, right? So I do want to acknowledge that when we talk about, strengthening and promoting the emergence and the uptake of deliberative tech and other pro-social tech, that can be supported and invested by communities, by local governments.
Outside of the big platforms, in a sense.
Exactly. Because the incentives for change for the large commercial platforms is absolutely a combination of regulatory pressure, legal cases that in some cases, as we know in the United States in particular, are underway, as well as to a certain degree, reputational pressure, right? And I think at the Council for Tech and Social Cohesion, we very much acknowledge that the avenue of regulation is one that can, over time, lead to important improvements by the large tech platforms, but that there will also need to be reputational pressure on these platforms that it is unacceptable for them, with the choices that they can make, to refuse to do so simply for primarily profit motives.
Right. The consequences could be horrendous. I mean, the worst example maybe is the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. But, God forbid we have to wait for something really major in the United States that's set off by some of these platforms. So it's very important that we take this really seriously. So in a sense, you're saying that we need to move from not just content moderation, which is sort of like whack-a-mole, but towards pro-social tech design.
Exactly. And, the content moderation as the sole demand is really problematic because it is very challenging without understanding intention and context to make really good decisions each and every time about what content is violating the policy. And you're really in a situation where there are concerns around censorship and free speech that we're not actually wanting to hand over to the platforms. So the answer by many of the collaborators at the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion is a couple things. One is to not rank and recommend content only based on engagement, meaning do not only recommend the next piece of content based on where you think people will click, but actually look at other signals that can tell us more about the quality and the credibility of that content and rank and recommend that content as opposed to just things that people click on. A colleague of mine, Ravi Iyer, often gives the example of, if you asked social media users what kind of content they would like to have in their feed, they would often, propose things that meet their aspirations of the kind of people that they want to be and become. In the same way, if I ask you, Jamil, what do you want to eat for dinner? You're not going to say chocolate cake only. But if I only give you chocolate cake and you take a bite, and then I understand that to mean, well, clearly Jamil likes chocolate cake, I'm going to give it to him every time. That's a really interesting metaphor to help us understand the difference between ranking on engagement and ranking for quality, right? And there's a couple other key things that social media companies can and should be doing to really be able to limit the virality of harmful content and the pushing people into those polarizing filter bubbles, right? That also comes down to how you allow individual users to invite people into groups and setting limits to that. A lot of the things that were learned about the January 6th Stop the Steal movement was because of certain features that the social media companies designed to promote greater use, engagement. You get lots of invitations, you go into different groups. So it was aimed at enabling greater usage on their platforms, but they didn't see that the downside of that was a lot of manipulation.
I think that's a very important point. Are there any ways to measure social cohesion in an online environment?
I think that the ways that we can measure social cohesion in an online environment would be very similar to the way we would measure it offline. Some of the, social media listening that we've done at Search for Common Ground in partnership with a fantastic organization called Build Up has aimed at helping us understand, whom are people following? How much do we understand where people are friends or followers of people perhaps beyond their ethnic or religious group or their geographical location? And I recall a program back in Lebanon. This was, with an influx of Syrian refugees just prior to the horrific explosion at the port, where we were doing some work to try to, shift narratives that were scapegoating Syrians for sort of all of Lebanon's problems. And we did some real analysis online to find out, a whole spectrum of personas and understanding who was following whom and whom was trusted. And how did that overlay with Lebanon's quite complex, sets of different sects and different religions and different regions.
It doesn't
and
get more complicated.
Right. And if we wanted to say which of these micro-influencers is actually going to be suitable to pass the message that, Syrians might not be put to blame for everything. And look, they actually are helping the Lebanese economy. So a lot of the same things that we had to do, Jamil, when we were asking ourselves, who's the audience that we're trying to reach through media, understanding what voice to bring to that radio or television show, what language to bring to it, what flavor, what social norm. It's the same kind of thing when you're asking yourselves, how do you work online? And understand how you rely on avenues of trust and seek to build more bridges of trust where there are none or where they're deteriorating.
Do you think that deliberative AI can help people access differing opinions in a way that isn't polarizing?
I think that there's huge potential for deliberative tech to really tackle polarization. And I think that the key is to build the trust so that the very people who are looking at each other across a very wide divide feel as though it's worth it for them to engage. There's been years of excellent bridging work. Living room conversations, for example, had been doing, decades of work of bringing people together to have dinner and understand each other's perspectives. And when COVID hit, they moved straight into digital platforms,
right?
Particularly ones like
Braver Angels and
right, exactly. And they've all been able to find ways to have, different kinds of online conversations. Sometimes even with conversation engines or basically pre-programmed AI facilitators of conversations. America Speaks was another example of that. And these are examples where when people participate in them, when people participate in programs like Solia, a virtual exchange, the result is measurably positive. The challenge, Jamil, and it's not a small challenge, is that there are still many people, particularly in polarized situations, who won't trust the process, who won't want to participate, either through fear or possibly through ignorance or a whole number of reasons. And so as peace builders, again, this calls upon us to find those people who are the bridgers, who have an uncle who is going to the sports club with that group of people that have not been interested in participating. And slowly, you begin to weave back the trust, and digital tools can help, but they only help when they're guided by people who understand what it takes to rebuild trust, to strengthen those relationships and keep that collaboration going.
Yeah, this has been such an interesting talk about, a problem that is very serious and could get even more serious. Is there anything that you'd like to add that I didn't really ask you about that you think is very important for people to recognize?
I want to say that, one of the things that is really compelling for me is to also ensure that as we take on some of these examples of deliberative tech, or as we seek to really advocate to the large tech companies that they change some of their design features, that it's really important that particularly countries that are affected by conflict, that they are part of this, that they benefit from this. It's not evident that even if the platforms make those changes, that will affect communities in Chad or in Myanmar or in Pakistan.
Right.
And that's really of concern to me. So, in many of these countries, I was at a forum of regulators networks from across the world a few weeks ago. And what I heard from them is that they are struggling to know what to do. I think there is 2 TikTok representatives for all of Africa. They can't even get a meeting with these platforms. And so they're really struggling with, how do I engage with these platforms? If you don't give me a way to find a path of agreement of how we handle harmful content, I'm going to need to shut you down. And yet, as you've seen in Africa and other places, when governments decide to close down social media, well, their citizens aren't happy about that, right?
Of course
So
not.
there's just a real dilemma. The way these issues play out in the global majority and in countries affected by conflict and crisis is really important. It's urgent. It's important that we don't leave these countries behind, even though we may be passing, some great child safety legislation in the global north. We need to ensure that as a global community, these wins, whether it's about, sponsoring more deliberative tech or really taking on a regulatory approach that's global, that advances. And that's really important to me.
Yeah. Europe, I think, is ahead of the United States in terms of their management of the online space, don't you think?
The quality of the regulation on the books is certainly at a different level. The challenge is actually enforcing that. And that's the phase we're in right now here in Brussels. The other thing that I am very excited about is the possibilities of generative AI to be really helpful for peace builders. And again, I say this without ignoring the fact that there are concerns about the way in which these large language models have been built and what data was used to teach them. I want to encourage other peace builders that might be listening to really explore the potential of generative AI for mentoring, for coaching, for practicing. Yesterday, I was talking with another organization about digital community stewards, and I said, well, what if we created a bunch of synthetic people, basically profiles using generative AI, and you help your digital stewards to practice what happens when suddenly everybody gets really mad about an issue of abortion or gun rights, right?
Yeah.
And you can actually, develop synthetic users and practice. And I think there's an enormous space for learning and skills building,
That's
scenario forecasting with some of this generative AI that's coming out. So I just really look forward to maybe when I've got some results, you can invite me back.
All right, terrific. We'll do that. This has been a real pleasure and a major eye-opener for us and our listeners, and I hope that lots of people get a chance to hear this. Lina, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas and experience with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I've enjoyed it.
You can learn more about Lina Slackmulder at techandsocialcohesion.substack.com. You can find links to Search for Common Ground's digital peace-building initiative in the show notes. For more content at the intersection of peace, conflict, and the media, follow us on LinkedIn and at Instagram at Making Peace Visible. You can also find us on X, formerly Twitter, at Making Peace Viz, spelled V-I-Z. If you like what you heard, please don't keep it to yourself. Take a screenshot of MPV on your podcast player and share it on your social media. Or better yet, send it to a friend. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced and edited by Andrew Maraskin with help from Faith McClure. Stephen Youngblood is the Director of Education for Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.